For figures just went public and instantly settled the debate that two sides of the internet have been fighting over for nearly 2 full years. $528,000. Music. $574,000 for $193,000. $350,000. Music. These weren't numbers pulled from a social media poll. They didn't come from a heated segment on ESPN. No fan voting produced them. No viral clip pushed them. No podcast opinion shaped them. A collective bargaining agreement applied a formula, ran a performance-based algorithm, evaluated 2 years of verified professional production across multiple players, enforced a set of contractual rules agreed upon by both sides, and then stamped those 4 figures onto an official salary sheet. And the second that sheet became public, Angel Reese's reaction told every brand, every league executive, and every sponsor currently analyzing women's basketball everything they needed to understand about how she responds to market signals she doesn't agree with. But before we get into that reaction, you need to understand the system behind it, because the salary difference between Caitlin Clark and Angel Reese is not the story people are turning it into. The gap is only a byproduct. The real story is the system that created it. And once you fully understand how that system actually works, the entire narrative surrounding these two players shifts completely. Buried inside the new WNBA collective bargaining agreement is a clause that most people discussing this haven't properly broken down. It does not care about your social media following. Music, it doesn't calculate how often your name trends online. It doesn't react to public campaigns, viral highlights, or which player an algorithm decided to boost that week. It links your contract value directly and strictly to your verified all-WNBA production during your rookie contract window. Clark, Music, activated that clause. Reese didn't. That alone is a complete mathematical explanation for a $178,000 base salary difference. And the clearer your understanding of this mechanism becomes, the harder it is to look at Reese's public response and take Music, any part of it, at face value. The clause is known as the EPIC clause, exceptional performance on initial contract. It was built into the new CBA as a performance-based accelerator. The people who designed this agreement spent years listening to criticism that the WNBA salary system didn't properly reward players who stepped in and performed at an elite level immediately. Under the previous structure, players moved upward at nearly the same pace regardless of output. A player who made 3 all-WNBA teams in 4 seasons was climbing almost alongside a player whose contribution barely extended beyond staying on the roster. That imbalance is exactly what the EPIC clause Music was created to fix. The requirement is straightforward and leaves no room for interpretation. Earn all WNBA honors within your first 3 professional seasons, and the league moves you on to an accelerated track toward maximum contract eligibility. You progress through the salary system faster than the normal timeline allows. The wording is intentional. It rewards proven production, not potential, not college reputation, not draft hype alone. Documented, verified, committee-approved performance at the professional level. Music. Clark earned first-team all-WNBA honors in her rookie season. 1 year into her career, the clause was already triggered. The formula had everything it needed, and the acceleration kicked in immediately. What's important to recognize here is that Clark isn't the only player this clause has benefited. The system isn't designed around one individual. Aaliyah Boston is the proof that removes any argument of favoritism entirely. Boston's salary jump is a number that should be drawing more focus in this conversation because it shows the clause functioning on a completely different player profile, under different conditions, and still producing exactly what the CBA designers intended. Music. She went from $94,000 to $574,000. That's not a typical raise. That's a complete contractual redefinition of her professional value based on 2 seasons of documented, verified production. Back-to-back all-WNBA selections in her first 2 years, combined with a two-way impact that reshaped how Indiana operates on both ends of court. Her presence forced opponents to adjust defensive coverages. It changed offensive entry angles in the post. It altered rebounding dynamics that every team in the league had to factor into their game planning. The selection committee doesn't hand out those honors casually. They evaluate production metrics across the entire league at the same time. When Boston earned consecutive All-WNBA selections, the clause activated and the salary sheet reflected it. $94,000 to $574,000. Music. The system working exactly the way it was designed to. That context becomes critical when you look at where Reese landed, because the argument that the formula is flawed or built specifically to favor Clark falls apart the moment Boston's number is placed next to it. The clause doesn't favor names. It recognizes production thresholds and applies them equally to every player. Music. Reese entered the league as the 7th overall pick in the 2024 draft. That draft position immediately worked in her favor. It lifted her above the base salary floor and moved her from $75,000 as a rookie to $350,000. Draft position matters in the WNBA's updated system, and her placement gave her a real early advantage over players selected later. Music. But this is where draft position reaches its ceiling. It can only take you so far. The second layer of acceleration, the epic clause pathway, requires all WNBA honors. Draft position alone doesn't meet that requirement. Performance does. Music. And across 2 full professional seasons, Reese has not secured a single All-WNBA selection at any level. Not second team, not third team, nothing. That's not media framing. That's a decision made by a selection committee whose job is to evaluate performance metrics across every player in the league using defined standards. Their responsibility is to determine which players performed at the highest level each season. After 2 complete seasons, that committee has not identified Reese as one of those players. And this is where the salary sheet becomes genuinely uncomfortable for anyone trying to frame this as bias or favoritism toward Clark. Cameron Brink, the 2nd overall pick from that same 2024 draft class, is sitting at $493,000. Sonia Kitchell, the 3rd overall pick from that class, is at $436,000. Music. Reese, taken 7th overall, sits below both at $350,000. Her own draft class is outpacing her financially. Music. Players selected ahead of her have climbed higher on the contract ladder within the same professional time frame. That reality surfaced publicly during the exact same week Reese chose to speak most loudly about the gap between her number and Clark's. The timing didn't strengthen her argument. It completely undercut it. To understand how 2 players entering the league in different draft classes ended up on such drastically different financial paths in such a short period of time, you have to go further back than the new CBA. You have to go back to where the separation actually began, because it didn't start in a contract negotiation room. It started in college, and it was visible to anyone paying close attention. Clark arrived with a record-breaking resume and a playmaking profile that scouts have been analyzing for years before she ever stepped into a WNBA environment. Her college production wasn't just high volume. It was a specific form of offensive orchestration that forced offenses to completely rethink their structure at the national level. Teams weren't simply trying to stop Clark from scoring. They were trying to solve an entire offensive system built around her ability to elevate everyone on the floor at the same time. That's a fundamentally different defensive problem, and it requires an entirely different level of game plan construction than most college players ever force coaches to design. When she entered the WNBA, she didn't arrive and simply rely on that reputation. She immediately translated it into documented, high-level production at the professional stage. Rookie record in assists, scoring impact, and playmaking efficiency. First-team All-WNBA in year 1. An all-star selection. A Team USA roster spot where her efficiency, scoring output, and decision-making place her in direct comparison with the best players on the planet, not just a league. Every one of those milestones was tracked, verified, and ultimately absorbed into a contract system that only responds to one thing: on-court production. Reese's first 2 seasons at the professional level told a noticeably different story. The headline was rebounding. She was collecting boards at a rate that generated attention, and the box score totals looked impressive at surface level. But once analysts moved deeper into underlying efficiency data, the picture became far more complicated. A large portion of her offensive rebound totals came directly from her own missed field goal attempts. In her second season, she shot 39% from the field overall. She finished below 50% on attempts inside 5 feet, From 5 to 9 feet, her conversion rate dropped to 13%. Her finishing rate around the rim sat at 31% in a season where she attempted the third most layups in the entire league. That level of efficiency is not a minor flaw. It represents a structural issue in her offensive game that actively generates the missed shots that then inflate her rebound numbers. The box score shows volume. The underlying context shows causation. And those two things tell very different stories about what her offensive presence actually contributes to team efficiency. Music. Clark's production, meanwhile, create effects that never fully appear in her own statistical line. And that's the analytical layer that makes this comparison so one-sided once you move beyond surface numbers. Defenses across the league could not afford to help off her without immediately surrendering open three-point attempts to one of the most consistent perimeter threats in the game. That defensive gravity unlocked driving lanes for Kelsey Mitchell that would not exist against a normal defensive shell. Music. It improved post-entry angles for Aaliyah Boston that collapse completely when defenses don't respect the perimeter spacing she forces. Sophie Cunningham and Lexi Hull consistently benefited from uncontested perimeter looks because multiple defenders were locked into tracking Clark's movement off ball. She pulled defensive attention away from teammates standing in open space, ready to shoot. That kind of offensive gravity doesn't appear in any single box score category. You won't see it in points, assists, or shooting percentage. You see it in team-wide efficiency shifts and system-wide spacing improvements. Music. You see it in how every opposing coaching staff had to reconstruct their defensive game plan before facing Indiana. You see it in the assist numbers of teammates who suddenly receive cleaner, earlier, higher quality looks than they would generate on any other roster. The All-WNBA Selection Committee evaluates exactly that type of systemic impact alongside raw production numbers. They are assessing what a player does to the entire structure of a team on both ends of the floor. And Clark's impact on Indiana's structure in her first season was strong enough that the committee placed her on the first team without hesitation. Snorts. The availability factor added another dimension to the comparison that the commercial side of the league was watching extremely closely. Reese's second season injury stretch extended across months of uncertain day-to-day updates with no clear, consistent timeline communicated publicly. During that same period, she was seen at promotional events tied to her Reebok deal while still officially listed as unavailable by the Chicago Sky. That contrast, appearing publicly in brand activations while officially sidelined, did not go unnoticed by the corporate partners tracking long-term athlete reliability. Brands that operate at scale value clarity during setbacks. They prioritize transparency and availability reporting, especially when athlete health is part of the public narrative. Indiana's communication structure around Clark's injuries, by contrast, was immediate, specific, and clearly documented. That organizational difference created a signal that extended beyond basketball. What the Epic Clause effectively did when the new salary figures were released publicly was produce the first official document in the Clark-Reese comparison that cannot be reframed through narrative spin. It is not media interpretation. It is not fan-driven ranking. It is not engagement-based perception. It is a contractual outcome generated by a collectively agreed performance formula inside the WNBA's labor framework. And when Reese reacted to that document, it revealed something significant, not just about her response to pressure, but about her understanding of the system that produced the number she was reacting to. But before analyzing that reaction and its commercial implications, the endorsement landscape has to be fully understood, because the $178,000 salary gap becomes almost irrelevant once you zoom out into the broader financial ecosystem. There's a parallel economy operating alongside CBA salaries, and it is not measured in hundreds of thousands. It is measured in tens of millions. Nike evaluated Clark's two-season professional trajectory and made a decision not based on trending volume, but based on measurable consumer behavior. They analyzed arena attendance growth, television rating spikes, merchandise velocity, and retail demand patterns across her first two seasons. Music. They assessed whether her presence was actually shifting product movement at scale and at a pace that justified long-term investment. The result was an 8-year, $28 million footwear partnership. Nike has spent over 4 decades identifying athletes who evolve into global commercial anchors, dating back to the earliest stages of modern sports marketing. They understand the difference between attention and conversion, between viral visibility and measurable consumer demand. They reviewed Clark's early professional data and committed to an 8-year horizon. That is not a speculative endorsement. It is a conviction investment. Gatorade entered the partnership from a different strategic angle entirely. Music. They built a signature product line around her, including a flavor release known as Rainbow 3. The product launch moved through retail channels at a pace that immediately created its own secondary media cycle independent of basketball performance. Gatorade does not assign signature flavors to athletes based on online popularity. They reserve that level of branding for athletes whose names generate measurable, repeatable consumer demand. The sellout velocity validated exactly that. Music. Internal expectations were reportedly exceeded faster than even the most optimistic pre-launch models had projected. State Farm approached the partnership from an entirely different commercial direction than Nike or Gatorade. The company has been shaping national advertising narratives since 1922, more than a century of continuous brand evolution. Across every major shift in American media culture, from the rise of television to cable dominance, from the internet boom to the social media transformation of modern sports marketing, music, they had never once selected a female athlete to serve as the central face of their national campaigns. Then the data tied to Clark's audience profile arrived on their desks, and a 100-year pattern broke instantly. A company that had built its identity over an entire century in one direction analyzed their numbers and made a decisive pivot. State Farm is not a trend-chasing brand reacting to viral attention. It is an insurance giant that builds its strategy on actuarial modeling and long-term probability forecasting. When a company like that adjusts a century-old marketing direction, it is not reacting emotionally. It is responding to data that leaves no rational alternative. Wilson Sporting Goods followed a similarly historic path by constructing a full signature product line around Clark. The last athlete in their history to receive that level of treatment was Michael Jordan. Music. Not another active WNBA player, not even a current NBA superstar in a championship window. Michael Jordan. Wilson examined his entire century-long archive of athlete partnerships and concluded that Clark's commercial impact justified a move they had only ever made at the peak of global basketball dominance. That internal comparison and the decision to act on it reveals more about Clark's actual market position than any ranking, headline, or salary figure ever could. That portfolio, Nike, Music, Gatorade, State Farm, Wilson, represents a simultaneous brand investment structure with no real precedent in women's basketball history. Every brand in that group had alternatives. Every one of them evaluated the broader market and chose Clark. The commercial ecosystem does not commit hundreds of millions of dollars based on sentiment or online discourse. It commits based on measurable behavior, music. And the data tied to Clark over 2 professional seasons produce a market response that the women's game has never seen at this scale. Reebok made a different bet. They signed Reese, invested real promotional energy into the launch, built retail infrastructure around the product, and pushed the campaign forward with legitimate marketing support. Then they watched the product remain on shelves for extended periods without hitting the sell-through velocity required to justify the investment. Marketing spend gradually tightened. Campaign visibility faded. Promotional activity slowed. Retail positioning shifted toward discounts, while overall brand messaging around the product became noticeably quieter. In the endorsement world, silence is never neutral. Brands do not reduce visibility when a campaign is outperforming expectations. They expand it. They increase ad spend, extend campaigns, and build additional product cycles. Music. Silence signals something very specific to internal teams. The return on investment is not meeting projections. That signal, over time, becomes a decision driver. The Reebok situation has now become one of the clearest publicly visible indicators in the current WNBA endorsement landscape. And it did not happen because of external bad luck or timing. It happened because consumer response did not match the initial projection model that justified the launch. Forbes ranked Clark 4th on its most powerful women in sports list, a ranking built entirely on revenue influence, brand impact, and commercial reach. It is not fan voting. It is not engagement popularity. It is a data-driven evaluation of financial influence. Sportico named her the most influential female athlete of 2025, using a similar analytical framework. When Clark appears simultaneously at that level across multiple independent commercial rankings, it reflects measurable market output, not narrative framing. Her front-row appearance at a Prada runway event was not symbolic placement. Luxury fashion brands assign that visibility based on cultural reach, media amplification potential, and consumer influence beyond sport. Clark earned that position because her visibility extends into markets entirely outside basketball. Reese's response to both the Forbes ranking and the Prada appearance followed a familiar pattern, one that traces back to their earliest competitive overlap. The dismissive tone, the public pushback, the immediate reframing through personal perspective rather than market context. That behavioral pattern matters in commercial analysis because brands actively evaluate how athletes respond to public positioning. They run sentiment tracking not just on popularity, but on how an athlete behaves when outcomes do not favor them. Consistency, professionalism, and emotional control under public pressure are weighted heavily in long-term endorsement decisions. Across 2 professional seasons, Reese's public response pattern has remained consistent in tone and approach. The commercial sector has not ignored that. It has incorporated it into its internal risk modeling. Clark's response pattern, in contrast, has been operational consistency. Performance on the court, continued participation at elite levels, steady endorsement expansion, and public messaging focused almost entirely on basketball execution rather than external narrative disputes. That difference is not accidental. It is structurally valuable in commercial terms. Brands entering 8-year, multi-million-dollar commitments require confidence that the athlete will not generate instability events that spill into brand reputation. They are not only investing in performance, they are investing in predictability. Every time Reese has escalated a public narrative, Clark has responded through performance, production, or market reinforcement that strengthens her existing brand profile. That contrast has been tracked continuously by sponsors evaluating both trajectories. Every public reaction from Reese becomes another input in the commercial evaluation cycle. Every one of them either stabilizes or destabilizes perception of long-term brand alignment. When the CBA salary figures were released and Reese responded publicly with frustration rather than structural analysis, it created an immediate new data point for every brand monitoring the situation in real time. Music. That data point does not exist alone. It stacks on top of every prior public interaction, forming a cumulative behavioral profile that brands interpret as either stable or volatile over time. And when Reese publicly stated she deserved $1 million in base salary, that statement became a high-visibility moment that brands could not ignore. Not a breakdown of the epic clause structure. Not an explanation of how all WNBA selection triggers salary acceleration. Not a focus on the performance pathway required to reach the threshold. A direct demand for a salary level disconnected from the documented production criteria that governs the system. The timing intensified the impact. Music. The salary release, the Forbes ranking, the Sportico evaluation, and the ongoing endorsement performance signals all converge in the same cycle. Nike, State Farm, Gatorade, and Wilson were all observing the reaction in real time, and what they saw reinforced the investment decisions already made across the market. For brands still evaluating long-term positioning, it created a clear behavioral reference point for how competitive pressure is expressed publicly, because underneath all of it, the core reality of the CBA remains unchanged. Music. The epic clause does not respond to opinion. It does not respond to perception. It does not respond to public statements about value. It responds only to one thing, all WNBA production. The path to a $1 million WNBA base salary is not rhetorical. It is structural. It runs directly through documented elite performance. That is the only mechanism that activates the formula. A social media statement demanding a higher salary does not interface with that system. It does not alter the equation. It only adds visibility, attention, and another behavioral data point for the market to evaluate. But it doesn't shift a single dollar in your contract value. Here is the forward-looking reality that the current numbers still don't fully capture. Music. Because the epic clause is not a static payout. It is an accelerating mechanism. And the trajectory that's placed Clark on makes Reese's $1 million demand appear even further detached from the financial reality actually unfolding. Music. Clark's $528,000 base salary is not a cap. It is a checkpoint on a contractual pathway that has already been structurally defined. She is projected toward maximum contract eligibility by 2027 based purely on her first-team All-WNBA selection in her rookie season. That single season triggered the acceleration framework. If she earns All-WNBA honors again in 2026, and her first 2 seasons already make that outcome a realistic projection rather than speculation, the next tier of the clause activates. Analysts who have modeled her contract progression under the current CBA framework place her on a trajectory toward a potential supermax value approaching $1, $7 million annually by 2028. Reese publicly demanded $1 million. Clark is contractually positioned to surpass that figure by a significant margin within the same time frame. Music. And the gap between their financial trajectories does not stabilize at $178,000. It expands over time. Music. It widens with every season Clark maintains her current production level. Music. It widens with every season Reese does not secure an All-WNBA selection. The math does not converge in her favor at any point under the present performance structure. It moves in one direction only, and it moves consistently. Indiana Fever entering 2026 with Clark, Aaliyah Boston, Kelsey Mitchell, Lexi Hull, and Sophie Cunningham all under contract is no longer a fringe playoff narrative. It is a legitimate championship-level conversation that the entire league will have to prepare for. A franchise paying Clark $528,000 while simultaneously generating tens of millions in external commercial value through deals with Nike and Gatorade is operating with an extraordinary return on contract value. Music. The league created the Epic Clause to reward production. Indiana built its roster around the first player who activated it. The outcome of both decisions is now compounding in real time, and the long-term effects are only partially visible in today's salary sheet. Every incoming college player entering professional basketball can now clearly see the divergence point. They can look at 2 athletes entering different draft classes, both carrying massive expectations and national attention, and trace what happens when performance translates, or doesn't translate, at the professional level. One player entered with historic college production, immediately triggered a performance-based acceleration clause, and entered endorsement partnerships driven by verified consumer behavior and measurable market response. The other player went on social media and demanded $1 million. 5 years ago, the combination of a $528,000 WNBA base salary, a $28 million Nike deal, a $50 million Gatorade partnership, and a Wilson signature line would have been unimaginable for any women's basketball athlete. Those numbers didn't emerge from hype cycles or viral momentum or algorithmic amplification. They emerged from documented performance, contractual triggers, and commercial partners making decisions based on real sales data and real-world consumer demand. Music. The market did not choose sides in this debate. It did not prioritize narrative, popularity, or online sentiment. It processed the numbers, and the numbers produce an outcome that no social media demand can override. Not this season, not the next, not at any point unless the Epic Clause is activated through verifiable All-WNBA production. The formula is fixed. The pathway is clear. The only variable left is execution, whether the player who needs to follow that path actually meets the standard it requires, or continues speaking about value while the system continues responding only to output. The gap between those two realities is $178,000 today. Music. By 2028, if current trajectories continue, it will be measured in millions, and no post, no statement, and no demand will change that direction.